Like, just reminded me, I want to
There's a
do
few,
this last thing I
there's a
forgot.
few like this, a few
Like,
options.
if you are familiar and comfortable with Hebrew, get this.
If you're familiar in,
And comfortable with Hebrew, get this. It's like art scroll level,
but it's all
spoon
Hebrew,
fed.
yeah.
That's what I'm saying. So if you're comfortable with Hebrew, get this guy.
I have it, I can show you.
If you're not comfortable with Hebrew, you stay with the English stuff. But if you're comfortable with Hebrew, definitely get a hold of this one. It's incredible.
So today we're doing Saturday.
Okay, yeah. So today, this next 3 weeks, I should say, before we get to review, is going to be Tzaddik Beis. Tzaddik Beis this week, I think we're doing Aleph Beis. The week after that, Gimel Daled. And then the week after that, I think is Hay to the end, which is Hay through Ches or Tes. I think that's how it's split up. Anyway, this week we're doing Aleph and Beis. Good morning, all. Aleph and Beis. This whole Tzaddik Beis is, really get to, pun intended, the beef of a lot of the subjects. Some of the heavy ideas are going to be explored in this simon, and a lot of it comes down to ChaNaN. Chaticha Nasa Nevela. Now, Chaticha Nasa Nevela is not going to be officially introduced until Sav Gimel, but the principle is relevant already in Aleph and Beis, as we'll see. It's not going to officially be mentioned in Gimel, but it's really before as well. So we're familiar with the principle of ChaNaN. ChaNaN, Chaticha Nasa Nevela, is essentially where an item becomes not kosher by absorption, then we know then it's not simply the absorption that's not kosher, it's the entirety that's not kosher. That principle is primarily with milk and meat. We're going to have a discussion later, I think, Gimel Daled, about whether and how it applies to other isurim, other prohibited foods that are absorbed, let's say fat absorbed in the meat, which we already discussed a little bit when we learned Kuf Hey. But that's going to come up as well again in later sifim. But the ChaNaN principle is actually primarily with respect to milk and meat. Why is that? Because milk and meat are inherently themselves kosher. When you have non-kosher fat fall into a piece of meat, then you can separate between what's kosher and what's not kosher. The meat is kosher, the fat is non-kosher, and now what you have to deal with is nullifying the fat, not the meat. And yet there are situations in which the entire meat will become not kosher because of the absorption of the fat. But really inherently, we can separate between the meat and the fat. We had that, for example, with the salt and the salty blood. The salt is not last week, right? The salt is not kosher. It's not treif. It's totally kosher. It's not usser. The blood is usser. So even though the salt is going farther than the flavor of the blood, but the blood stops. So you don't say that the salt became non-kosher salt, right? Because you can separate between the salt and the blood. We know what's kosher. We know what's not kosher. When it comes to milk and meat, inherently each of them are kosher. What's not kosher is their mixture. So that's when we say chaticha nas nevela. If a piece of meat absorbs milk, then it's not just the milk inside the meat that's not kosher. It's not true. The milk inside the meat is totally kosher.
Can you say in theory that the mixture only goes because of the intensity of how it was mixed, that it only stays in a certain...
Very much so. Very much so. That's going to become a big, that's a huge part of the subject here. Is to what degree do we say ChaNaN? How intense is it? And does anything have to happen to trigger the ChaNaN? If it got mixed all together, if the piece of meat sat separate, that's all going to come into play to understanding the principles of ChaNaN, exactly what you just asked. But just to understand that the principle of it is because the milk and meat are inherently kosher. It's only their mixture that become not kosher. So when you're dealing with a piece of meat that absorbs milk, it's not just the milk that has to be nullified, because the milk is not the treif, it's not the usser. It's the milk and meat that have to be nullified. Unless the whole thing has to be nullified, really. Because all of it is a mixture of milk and meat. Okay, so the principles and limitations of that are going to be discussed at great length in this siman. When does it happen? At what point does it happen? Does it require a trigger? And so on and so forth. Okay, so zooming into Sif Aleph and Beis, there's another principle we need to understand, which is like this. Two things, some of which we already touched on way back in Kuf Hey. Another one we haven't really discussed before. The first is the principle of Taam ki-Iker, which is that the flavor is like the thing itself. Right? We had this way at the beginning. This is the whole principle of all this discussion is whether the absorbed has the flavor of the absorbee. Is that the right word? No, the other way around. The absorbee has the flavor of the absorbed. Right? Because that's the primary issue here. Taam ki-Iker, the flavor of the non-food kosher item is as if the kosher item, non-kosher item is there, and we have to discover whether the flavor is there or not. The same thing is true of milk and meat. Milk and meat, the prohibition, as we learned, is in the Torah, that, biblically speaking, the prohibition is only in bishul, right? Because again, the two things are kosher. Torah says they're forbidden in their mixture. What kind of mixture makes them forbidden? Well, only the kind of mixture which is bishul, cooked. Rabbinically, there are other types of mixtures that are prohibited. Kavush, pickling, salting, we learned that last week, right? But really, it's only bishul. Now, bishul properly is when flavor transfers all the way through from one place to the other, right? So, in theory, you could, as we're going to learn from the Machaber, in theory, you can ask a non-Jew to taste that piece of meat and say, do you taste any milk in it? He tells you no, good, the piece of meat is kosher, even if there isn't 60 ratio. Because really, it's a question of Taam Kikar. Do you have the taste of the milk or not? And the answer is no, totally kosher, because the flavor didn't mix, so it's not bishul together, because there's no flavor mixed through. Yeah, we're going to learn the principles of this as well.
60 regardless, even if you don't, or that's a discussion.
Well, it's a discussion, but inherently at the core halacha, as the Machaber writes it, as long as the non-Jew tastes it and says there's no milk, it's fine.
But the 60 comes about because that was what the established.
You don't have a non-Jew. If you don't have a non-Jew to rely on, so can you go 60 to the ratio? Because 60 will tell you that the flavor is not there anymore. 60 ratio is when we said that the flavor is nullified. So it's not as if the 60 has some magical power. It's a very practical thing. 60 times the amount means we're guaranteed the flavor's not there anymore.
Aren't there things like that in Torah once it's established now that this is the shear? It's kind of like a magic.
The Ramah will say we no longer rely on the goy. The Ramah says we no longer rely on the goy, and we always go by 60. But inherently, the 60 is not a magical number. It's built in the principle of getting rid of the flavor, which in theory, the Ramah will agree that the original halacha is you ask the goy. But today we don't rely on the guy anymore. Yeah.
It gets complicated if you ask the guy because they might not be an expert to their chef.
Okay, so we're going to get into that a little bit now, but more in other simonim. Sorry. We're going to get other simonim where if you have to either ask a guy which is a professional, Uman, he's a professional taste tester.
Chef,
yeah, so he can tell you there's milk in there, or mesiach lefitumai, which means he speaks nonchalantly. He doesn't think you're trying to get something out of him, because if he does, he's going to respond based on what he thinks you want from him. Right, so he has to speak. Mesiach lefitumai means he's just speaking casually, nonchalantly. He just says, "Oh yeah, I don't see any milk in there," and then you can trust him. And I guess that's part of why the Rambam might have said, "Okay, you know what? Don't rely on this anymore, and just go with the 60 ratio." That's going to come up as well. Now, this leads us to the next principle, which is you can only detect the taste of another flavor if the other flavor is different than the original flavor. So it's min B'SheEino Mino. One item being absorbed into another item that isn't of the same food type. Milk into meat. Meat tastes one way, milk tastes another. So you can test if it's tasted or not. What if it's min b'minoi, non-kosher meat into kosher meat? You cannot taste. Over there, even the Machaber will say you cannot ask a guy because all meat, the flavor tastes the same. It's all beef. Just one happens to have had a bin treifa. One happens to be where the lung was pierced, and one where the lung wasn't pierced. But they're really both the same flavor. So you could not ask a guy there, right? Which is why we learned in Kufay, when we're learning Taruvus, 60 to ratio. Right? Always. Never learned this thing with flavor, of tasting, because the taste was all the same till now. Right? Now, this itself is a matter of dispute. There is a view in the Rishonim that because the flavor is the same, it's actually never nullified to the complete extreme. When you have flavor, so you nullify it by getting rid of the flavor. When you can't detect the flavor, it's always forbidden, period. We don't rule that way. We rule that it's 60 to the ratio because we're measuring if it were a different flavor, would it be nullified? If the answer is yes, then no problem. Now, when does that become relevant? It becomes relevant in milk and meat. It becomes relevant when you apply the principle of ChaNaN. Here you see our principles stack upon each other. When you apply ChaNaN, how's that? Because you have a piece of meat that absorbs milk. And let's say it qualifies as ChaNaN. So the entire piece of meat is now not kosher. Now, when that piece of meat falls into a pot, what flavor is emitting? Not the flavor of milk. The flavor of milk's been nullified way long. Because the pot's huge.
No, but it fell on the piece.
Fell on a piece of meat.
Outside,
that
it
piece of
fell on the
meat-
piece outside the pot, and
Let's
then
say it fell outside the pot. This is going to be a big discussion. Is the meat inside the pot? Is the meat outside the pot? Is it half in, half out? It's going to be a huge discussion that's going on here. That's why I'm laying these principles out so you see how this works. Let's just imagine it's outside and it qualifies completely as ChaNaN. Even if that qualifies as ChaNaN, it's a good question. We'll get into that. Let's just say it qualifies as ChaNaN, right? So now,
the flavor's going to affect the piece of meat.
so now the meat's not kosher.
So you have to look at the piece compared to the whole
So
pot.
maybe the meat will have a little bit of flavor of milk because it's still, if it doesn't have any flavor of milk, then it's bottled there. It has a little bit of flavor of milk.
Yeah.
But now that piece of meat fell into a pot. The pot's way more than 60 of that little piece of milk. So you will not taste the milk in that pot.
What about the meat?
But you will taste the flavor of that meat. Can you detect it? You can't detect it anymore. You can't detect the flavor of meat because the pot had meat already.
Right.
So now it's min b'minoi. Now,
so
so
one opinion that's not halacha would say the whole thing. Is not.
so the whole exactly that opinion might say the whole thing is treif. But so this is going to play in to our principles here as well, or as we learn, understanding that basar b'chalav, milk and meat can also become min b'minoi, where the meat itself is now a basar b'chalav piece. Chati chanas nevela. The way the Gemara puts it is, we use the language chati chanas nevela, which also comes from the Gemara, but the Gemara uses another language, which I don't know why it didn't catch on, but it makes the principle very strong. The halacha, the Gemara's language is efshar l'soitoi aser. Even if you're capable of squeezing out the original flavor, it's still forbidden. Because then, so even if you took a piece of meat and you squeezed it and all the milk came out, it wouldn't matter. That piece of milk, that piece of meat is a milk and meat cooked piece of meat. And that's why chati chanas nevela, the very meat itself, became a piece of milk and meat, even though the milk had been squeezed out.
Wouldn't work because we say halal.
Correct. Efshar l'soitoi aser means even if there's no more flavor of milk, that piece of meat is still aser because it was cooked as a basar b'chalav. And now that piece of meat is a nevela. And therefore, chati chanas nevela. Therefore, that piece of meat is a nevela. We clear? Yeah. It's just going to become very
If
relevant.
it wasn't cooked, it was cold, and you squeeze it out.
If it wasn't cooked, then it wouldn't have
Mina
absorbed.
yeah.
Then it wouldn't have absorbed. You rinse it off and,
Yeah.
right? That was last week.
Yeah.
Rinse it off and eat. Right? They wouldn't have absorbed.
But can't you say since there's meat is similar to all the other meat in there, and it just because the meat's going to taste a little different because of the milk, it's still going to be about the shishi. The pot is bigger than 60 times.
Okay, so it could be a big question. Do you have to be able to have, even if you don't need, even though the flavor of the milk is not there anymore because it's more than 60 in the entire pot, do you still have to have some of the flavor of the milk, even though it's less than 60, and then you need 60 against it? What if you don't even have that? Do you not then then you not need 60? It's also going to become a discussion as well.
Isn't the principle of ChaNaN that the whole entire piece of meat becomes like triple?
Correct.
So wouldn't you need 60 times that whole piece of meat?
Right, but the question is, does that ChaNaN is not an absolute. There are limitations to ChaNaN. And one of the discussions is going to be if ChaNaN is only true when at least there's some of the milk still left in there. Even if it's less than 60, it's 1,000 ratio. It has to be some. That's also going to become a discussion.
So one in and then it left?
No, well, the flavor of the meat's going out. The flavor of the meat drags with it the mixture of milk and meat. Right? So that also has to play in. Or no, even if there's no milk left, like you're saying, it's absolute ChaNaN, and even if just the flavor of the milk meat goes out, it's still treif. That's going to become a discussion as well. Yeah? Okay. Okay, so now with all that in mind, Sif Aleph and Beis are two opposites. They're reverse. And because of the principles I just explained, Sif Beis is going to be much more involved than Aleph. Even though we're going to learn in later Sifim whether ChaNaN applies, let's say we're going to learn if does ChaNaN apply to salting. We had it a little bit already in Kufay. Does ChaNaN apply to a kavush, to pickling? Does it apply to grilling? All that's going to come into play. And it's even the question of, which we also touched on a little bit previously, is do we say ChaNaN by liquid? Does an entire liquid become ChaNaN? Let's say you have hot milk, right? And it has to be hot, by the way.
Gravy.
And a little bit of gravy falls in there. And the whole thing is mixed together. Does the whole milk now become ChaNaN? The answer is probably yes.
No.
As we'll learn, it's also going to come into play. But nonetheless,
You said liquid's a lot harder than solids. So
sorry?
when it comes to liquids, a lot harder.
Okay, so we had before the issue of if the milk was cold and something fell in, which in theory, all you need to do is peel off the milk.
Right.
You can't peel off the milk because this milk is, but now the milk is boiling. So now it's not a question of peeling,
Right.
it's a question of bittul b'shishim. And if it's not bittul b'shishim, the entire bowl of milk now become a aser ChaNaN.
Yes.
Right? Because you don't have 60 to the ratio of the milk. Because it's only when it's boiling that this happens. If the bottom is cold, now you're back to last week where you peel it off,
It's not possible.
which is not possible in liquid. We had the machlokes if they have 60 against what would be the peel or not. Right? We had that.
Let's say you have, let's say gravy, it's very strong. So you'll still taste it, but it's more than shishim. So
No, but taste.
Okay, we're gonna have the question of tavlin, salty. Yeah, when it comes to spices, the
Yeah.
shishim may not apply. That's gonna come later as well. Good point, because that's a good point. That's a very good point. Because
Small amount, but it's
exactly, it's a very, very good point. Because the issue of shishim is not a magical number; it's an issue of flavor.
Mhm.
If you have such a food item which requires much more than 60 to be a bottle, it's not gonna be a bottle.
Hmm.
Case of spices, yes,
yeah,
correct.
the gravy.
That's it, spicy gravy. Yeah, that'd be a very good point. Yes, very good, very good. Okay. Okay, so the first sif aleph is going to be milk. Sorry, a piece of meat that falls into boiling milk or hot milk, and bays is going to be the reverse when milk falls into a pot of meat. So the first one is going to be much easier to deal with, right? Because a piece of meat that falls into milk, you have to have either 60 to the ratio in your milk or ask the guy to taste if the milk has any meat flavor, right? That piece of meat's obviously going to be forbidden because it has much less than 60 to the ratio of milk that absorbed. Obviously, that piece of meat's gone. The question is the milk. Now, there's another issue, which is the play of ChaNaN that comes in here is if the piece of meat was in the milk long enough to firstly absorb, so the piece of meat is usher, and now it has enough, but what if it has enough time to now emit as well? And now it's emitting not its own flavor, which was the first problem, that the milk can't have any flavor of meat, or the milk has to have 60 to the ratio of the, but now it's also emitting milk and meat. Right? So now in that case, you can't ask God anymore. Because sorry?
Can't detect the flavor.
Because you can't take the flavor anymore. It's a flavor of milk. But that milk that's being emitted out of the meat is ChaNaN milk. So you can't detect it anymore. So you would also agree with that 60 there as well.
Does that mean even if he detects, he can still detect the taste of milk? It's
The whole bowl is milk.
okay.
If you detect the flavor of meat, for sure not.
Yeah.
But if it waits long enough, then you can't even rely on the fact that it doesn't detect meat, because you have to now make sure to not detect milk. Because the milk that was in there became ChaNaN, that's not coming back out again. That's going to be a discussion in Sif Aleph. Sif Beis is going to be, again, as much said, much more involved. And it's the Shulchan Aruch is not going to be super clear on the exact case it's talking about, because it can use the same language twice, but not really explain itself. If you have a text in front of you, just to demonstrate. So if you look at Sif Beis, you have a text in front of you? No, not everybody does. Look at Sif Beis, look at the Hebrew, not the English. I assume the English will fix it up. Nafal chalav l'toich kadera, milk fell into a pot, shel basar of meat. You taste the meat, the piece of meat that it fell onto. So where did the milk fall?
On the meat.
Onto a piece of meat,
Mhm.
right? But what did he say? He
Why
says,
did it say into the Turk Kadesh?
oh, exactly. Now, that's going to be one din. Now, skip to after the Ramah's gloss, after the Ramah's first gloss, where it says v'chein in the Shulchan Aruch itself. V'chein nafal l'toich ha'marok, as likewise, if the milk fell into the marok, that means the soup or the gravy, or l'chatichas, or to the pieces. How's it different than the first case? Right? The language is a little bit different. Fell into the pot, that piece of meat gets to taste. Then, but also if it fell into the milk, into the soup, and onto the pieces, they're explaining what the relationship between the pieces and the pot is. Where is this meat this piece that the milk is falling onto relative to the rest of the stew?
Outside the pot, I guess.
Is it outside?
Probably
Is
outside
it
the
in?
first case, and the second case is inside the pot.
So it's not very clear. And this is going to become a discussion in the Ramon, in the Shach and the Taz to understand this. And actually, in this case, the Ramah is going to be lenient. Another case where the Ramah is lenient. So the simplest way of learning it is, and I think this is probably the way the English does here, but the simplest way of learning it is like this. The first scenario is where the piece of meat is,
Yeah.
the first case is going to be, the first one is going to be where the piece of meat is in the mixture, but partially popping out.
Falls in that.
And falls in that part. So the big machlokes is this, because the machlokes go back to Rashi and Rabbeinu Taam, Rashi and Liri, actually not Rabbeinu Taam, Liri, goes back to the Rishonim, which is how do I treat that piece of meat which is partially out? Do I treat it as if it's mixed into the rest of the stew? And if it's mixed into the rest of the stew, then all I need is 60 from the entire stew against that piece of milk. That's it. But if I treat it like it's outside the stew, then I need 60 against either against the entire piece. And if I fail to have 60 against the entire piece, I have to have 60 from the entire stew against the entire meat, because the meat is now ChaNaN. So each one is a kula and a chumrah. It's not like that's going to be machlekes actually. It's a machlekes in the Shach and the Taz whether you take kula and chumrah or you take chumrah. That's going to be a machlekes. But you can see how this plays out. You see the principle here? If I treat a piece of meat like it's double-edged. Let's say I have a very large piece of meat, right? Let's imagine the piece of meat's outside, right? And you have the pot and the piece of meat outside. Drop a piece of milk onto that massive steak. It's fine, completely fine. Right? Because 60 times the amount, right? No problem. Now, what happens if I pour a lot of milk? Sorry, let's play this out again.
Meats outside the pot.
Now, let's just say, okay, let's say that meat is 59 times the amount of milk that fell onto it. Yeah? I pour it on. And that entire piece of meat is ChaNaN. I take the piece of meat, I put it into my pot. Now, this steak is a centerpiece of the pot. So there's no 60 in the rest of the stuff to that piece of meat. So everything is now treif. Everything's now not kosher. Even though there's 100 times flavor to the milk. Because we don't have to nullify the milk. We have to nullify the entire steak now. Sorry?
The steak is its own.
The steak is in Chati ChaNaN Nevela.
So you'd probably say if it's Bishul, right? But actually, the Bishul would probably be like this type. Because Bishul would be the right. So you want to be more certain.
That's going to come up as well.
And if it was Rabbanan, you'd probably be lenient.
That's going to come up as well, yeah. But now you follow that? You have a piece of steak that's 59 ounces big.
Yeah.
Make the numbers easier.
Yeah.
You put an ounce of milk. No nullification in that piece of steak.
Yeah.
So the entire steak now is treif. I put that piece 59 ounce steak. It's huge. It's a roast, right?
Yeah.
And I put it into the pot. I don't have what's 60 times 59. I don't have 3,000 ounces of gravy and vegetables and everything else.
Even meat, even
And veggies and beans and barley. I don't have that much of everything else to nullify the entire piece of meat.
Yeah.
So because the entire piece of meat becomes treif now.
Exactly.
Now,
But
unless you have that much to nullify, now you need to nullify the
entire piece of meat.
now.
That's ChaNaN.
Not just that one.
Correct. That's
one
the principle of ChaNaN, right? That's the principle of ChaNaN. But I definitely have 60 more than the actual drop ounce of milk.
But it doesn't matter. This one because our my meat's on.
Exactly. But if that piece of meat were inside the stew to begin with, and now it fell onto that piece of steak,
because it's sticking out just a little bit, let's say.
let's say it's not sticking out.
Oh.
Let's go with the second case where it's not sticking out.
But if it's not sticking out, then it wouldn't just be the meat; it'd be the whole pot you consider.
Oh, so if the meat is not sticking out, if the meat,
liquid.
oh, sorry. So if the meat's not sticking out, and it fell onto that piece of meat,
But
well,
why would you use language of meat when it's falling into the pot of liquid?
Good
The meat's
question.
at the bottom of the pot of liquid,
So if the-
but it's not like
Okay, good question.
unless the meat is
So there's
sticking
the
out.
difference
It's
in
in my
Very
mind.
good question.
In my mind,
that's the Shach has to
So
discuss
there's the
that.
difference in
Well,
your
that's a
two
very good
cases.
question. That's going to come up. Keep that in mind. Yes, but I'm going to make with the principles clear. Yes. What do you want to say?
That's the difference in your two cases.
Yes. So
In
now,
the second case, it's that piece. It's the same exact stew, but the piece of meat is already in the.
oh, it doesn't.
And now you have your 1 ounce of milk that falls in to the 59 ounce steak, but with the pot.
Correct. So I have
Now it's
100
about- now it's
ounces.
about
Now I have 100
59
ounces. That's right. So now I have 100 ounces to a piece of
And
milk.
now you're okay.
Now I'm okay. But what if the piece of meat is half in, half out? And it falls into the part that's popped out. Do I treat it like it's outside?
Mhm.
So the whole meat is now ChaNaN,
Go back
and I have to have
to
60 to the ratio of that
Exactly.
piece of meat
So you go back to the principles of
ChaNaN.
of
of ChaNaN, Chati ChaNaN Nevela,
Yeah.
the piece of meat now, right? Or do I say, well, no, because it's partially in, the whole entire stew is enough? Okay, it's a machlokes. Ramon shot. The Ramon Machaber. The Ramon's going to be lenient, right? So that's the question. Do I treat it like it's in or out? The Ramon's going to say that we treat it as if it were inside.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how come if milk falls on a piece of meat, you can't just get rid of that piece of meat? You can't really cut. You can't cut.
Say again.
If it's outside, why are we not allowed to cut? Even if it's hot, because burning hot, so it absorbs right away.
What do you mean cut?
The spot, sorry.
The spot. Milk falls on a corner.
Okay, we're gonna get to
You're
that.
talking
Also.
about a 59-ounce roast. Milk falls on a little corner. An ounce of milk falls on a little corner. Let me just chop
Yes,
a
yes,
thumb
yes.
worth more, and it's
Yeah.
my whole rest.
So
of
I should that's correct. I should make it clear. The whole bittul thing is only when you can no longer identify where the piece of milk is.
Okay.
If you identify where it is, you have to get rid of it. That's right.
Yeah.
You can identify where it is you chop off that piece of meat that has milk in it.
Yeah. Now, well, maybe yeah, maybe no, but certainly you could not. You can't say it's bottle when I can see the milk right there.
Okay.
You certainly can't do that, right? Which is going to become another principle, which is, what if I shake it up right away?
In your pot?
Yeah.
That's not a thing.
Can I do that?
That's
You
not a
might-
thing.
You might want to do
You-
that, might be there.
You might want to do that actually.
Well, you might want.
And then
I
I'm
want
gonna
to
say-
shake off the bus so you can't see it. Right, so then it becomes
Correct.
spittle. You're right.
Oh.
That's why.
So in many cases, actually, we're going to learn that I was going to learn that you should do that
Before it becomes
So make-
ChaNaN.
before it becomes ChaNaN.
Wow.
That's correct. Can you do that before it becomes ChaNaN quickly?
Huh?
Or maybe worse,
Okay.
in certain scenarios. Sorry. First of all, do it. Maybe I want to do it before it becomes ChaNaN. A. B. Another principle to be worried about, depending on the situation, as Ramaz is going to point out, doing that might actually make the ChaNaN. Might actually trigger the ChaNaN. Now that I mixed the flavor into the whole piece of meat, now Mamish made a ChaNaN. Before maybe it wasn't ChaNaN because it was just over there in the corner. Now that I mixed together, now the whole piece became ChaNaN.
Covering also made.
Covering as well. And right away, if I did it later, does it have to be stirred the entire time while it's cooking until it cools down?
So what, the best thing is
These are all going to come up in
So
sifes, which are very involved
Could
sifs.
be good or a problem also.
Correct.
So what's your best thing? You
Correct.
pour the milk in there. You see the milk for a second because it hasn't fully dissolved yet. You take a ladle, whatever you take out whatever you can, and then you shake the rest.
Something like that.
So then whatever.
You may not even have to ladle it out. You may not even have to do that. Yeah.
No, you're saying just shake, but then you have an issue of how much you put into ChaNaN. I'm saying at least if you ladle out the majority of it, then whatever's left, you're
Okay,
guaranteed.
let's just say,
you're
but
guaranteed
because
to-
that I was going to write, you have to mix it up right away, mamish. Take it,
Really?
yeah, mamish. Look at the last line of Ramah. The last line of Ramah. The ain't my mashiach, the English near me. Yad shenafla isif hachino. Very last.
Never mind. Okay.
Im loy near me. Yad shenafla iser.
Immediately.
Yeah. So you may have to do it right
Yeah.
away,
He
mamish.
says
But you can see that
immediately.
it's only you'll see it's very specific cases. Like you said at the beginning, it's going to be if the meat was outside and then it went in. So you mixed it into the entire pot before that piece became ChaNaN, right? Because your piece of meat's outside.
Right.
If it becomes ChaNaN, you're gonna have to have 62 entire piece of meat.
Uh-huh.
But you mixed it in before it became ChaNaN. But the moment you let it sit and it becomes ChaNaN, now you can't do that anymore, right? So you have to catch it before it becomes ChaNaN. But in other cases, like where the piece of meat is partially in, partially out, mixing it together might trigger the ChaNaN.
I understand. Basically, what you want is you don't want the piece of meat to become ChaNaN, but you want the pot, you want the B'SheEino in the entire pot.
Correct.
So when the second you pour it in, you don't want it to like touch the meat or touch anything. You want to mix it into the
Correct.
liquid right away so that it then
Correct.
B'SheEino
But conversely,
Okay.
conversely, if it fell on,
absorbed into that piece of meat.
Correct.
Exactly.
conversely, we're going to learn, at least according to some opinions, if the meat is popping partially in, partially out, doing that might actually trigger the ChaNaN.
Oh, yes, I guess, because then you're
Right?
getting because it's out.
It's out.
Yeah.
And that'll, right? So that's going to explain a lot of the discrepancies because there's two different cases in Sebeis, and the Shulchan doesn't tell you what the cases are.
See, this
But
is
in one
this is
case,
very involved
And in
semantics,
both
I see.
cases, it's a machlekes Ramah.
So what
Shulchan
are
Aruch.
the ways we're going to be learning it now? What are the accepted ways to learn the beginning and the end?
The first half is going to be where it's
Pieces
where
completely.
the piece is partially in, partially out.
Ah.
The first case, and the second case is going to be where it's fully in or fully out, depending on how you learn it.
Oh.
But fully in, Ramah, fully out.
How do they explain why it says Marak at the end?
Sorry,
Why does it say Marak at the end? Like, how does that explain?
because it's fully in, which is why it fell onto the maraq, so it's fully in the mixture, or it fell onto a piece of meat, which is inside the stew, and you don't know which piece of meat it was. And if we treat it like it's still like it's in the stew, right? And that's when he's going to say that you mix the pot around because you don't know where it is. So you might as well mix it around.
Shulchan Aruch says
The
that?
Shulchan Aruch says that, yeah. mix it all around till everything's mixed up because it fell into the soup, or it fell into a piece of meat which is in the soup, and you don't know where in the gravy, in the right, if it's in the liquid, and you don't know in the stew, and you don't know which piece of meat it is. So mix it all around quickly, right? Whereas the Ramah, it seems, is doing a switch on the situation, where he's saying it's only if you mix it right away, but he's probably talking about a piece of meat which is outside the stew. It's only been 3 cases really. First, where it's partially in, partially out. Second, where it's completely within, and 3, where it's out. And then you're throwing it in and mixing it right away, as per Ramah, as we'll see. But all these, you have to make a consistency between the Shulchan Aruch throughout and between the Ramah and throughout, which is why the Shach and the Taz are going to be discussing, and Dr. Moshe and others, not Dr. Moshe, the Kiveger and Chavaz Das, are we discussing exactly what the case, what each case is. That way, they all become consistent.
But regardless, it's all about whether or not it's ChaNaN.
Whether or not ChaNaN happens,
Yeah.
which is why it's funny, because Sif Aleph and Beis will lie in ChaNaN, even though ChaNaN technically isn't introduced till Gimel. Yeah. Daled actually. Right, but Aleph Beis will rely on these principles. Yeah. Okay, so let's recap the principles we covered, and then we'll use that in our brain as we go through Aleph and Beis. Be very involved. So, principle 1 is Taam Ki'ikr, which we spoke about. The flavor itself is what makes the flavor that brings the actual item there. Issue 2 is whether it's min bin minoi or not min bin minoi, min B'SheEino minoi. If it's min bin minoi, if it's min B'SheEino minoi, it's something of a different type being absorbed into something else, then you can detect the flavor, that the flavor is detectable. But if the flavor is not detectable, it becomes, you have to rely on 60, you cannot rely on a goy, right? That's number 1. And then we have the principle of ChaNaN, right? And the questions of so ChaNaN has 2 things. When piece of meat falls into milk, the milk becomes ChaNaN, and therefore your ratio of milk has to be 60 because you can't detect the flavor of the milk that went into the meat and came out of the meat. Because the milk became ChaNaN.
I have a question.
Right? Yeah?
In terms of this case with the goy teching and everything, so they take your, let's say it's a fleshik pot, so they take the fleshik spoon and they then taste it,
Pour it out was different.
and then they say, oh no, it tastes like milk. Now that spoon, is that now a treif spoon, because now it's the mixture of meat and
If it's
milk
on, if
that
it's,
it touched?
if it's on the boiling pot, maybe.
That's what I'm trying to say. They're testing
Yeah.
it on the boiling pot.
But you can pour it out, or you can use a plastic spoon, or whatever. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Okay.
That's
Now comes to the meat. The ChaNaN becomes much more difficult because now the question becomes, because in this case now the question is if the entire piece of meat now becomes itself a problem, and thus the ratio of nullification is required. Not, first of all, you can no longer do the taste test, even according to Mechaber, because you're dealing with a piece of meat falling into a pot of meat stew. A. B. You now have to have a ratio of 60 against the entire piece of meat, not just against the milk that was in it. Right? And that's going to be in 3 different scenarios, 3 different halachas. If it's inside the pot, right? So then you're mixing it around because it's already in the stew. If it's outside, maybe you can mix it around. Depends how quickly you're dealing with it and whether you're following Mechaber or Ramah.
The first thing you said, the mixing, you have to do that immediately, or it doesn't work.
According to the Shulchan Aruch, Ramah, yes. Mechaber, maybe not immediately. The Ramah will have a leniency that if you did it right at the beginning, it's fine, even if you didn't keep it mixing it later. The Shulchan Aruch will still have to be covered or mixing the entire time until it cools down, which is even more involved. So there's a leniency and a stringency in Ramah and Mechaber there, we'll learn. That's if it's inside the pot already. If it's half in, half out, that's where you have the real machlokes going on, where you have both a kula and a chumrah happens at the same time. Do I treat the piece of meat, which is half in, half out, as if it's outside? And therefore, if I have 60 at a piece of meat ratio, then I'm good to go. If I don't, if it's like it's outside the pot, then I have to have 60 to the ratio of the entire piece of meat. But if it's inside the pot, I only have to have 60 to the ratio of the milk, not against the whole piece of meat.
The first thing is if it's half
in, half
if it's
out.
half in, it's still considered part of the whole mixture.
Machlokes. This is the machlokes. If it's half in, half out, and it falls in the piece in part of the meat which is outside, if I treat it like it's outside, then I need 60 against that piece of milk on that piece of meat itself. And if I don't, then I need to have 60 in the pot against the entire piece of meat. There's my chumrah. Correct.
Because it goes back to fatty and lean, right? If the Ramah says
Maybe it's linked. Maybe it's linked.
Because the Mechaber would say most pieces are normally.
Maybe that's linked. Maybe it's linked. I didn't see it written anywhere. Maybe it's linked. It's Geshtikl Svara. Maybe, right? But if I treat it like it's inside the pot, and then I need to have 60 against just that piece of milk and makes it
Easy.
much easier to nullify that milk. I just have to have a 60 grams whole piece.
Yeah. Do you usually 60 ounces is your pot? Your pot's gonna be more than 60 ounces, like realistically.
If it's an ounce of milk.
If it's an ounce of milk.
Could be more.
100.
Yeah.
What do you mean? I agree. You put 5 ounces of milk, but then you're already putting 5 ounces of milk in your pot. That's gonna definitely create flavor because a lot of milk.
Unless you have a massive stew. I don't
And then you
know.
have a massive stew. Then it's not. Yeah.
All it's a
It's a
ratio.
ratio.
Yeah. Which is important because like, it's going to say kazayas, but it doesn't necessarily mean kazayas. It could be any size. So long
Yeah, I
as it's
was
something.
wondering about that.
It's like me saying an ounce. Not because I
Uh-huh.
mean an ounce specifically, but just using that as
But
an
it
easy.
has to be at least like the other has to be at least like a less than a on top of it.
The only difference would be if it's deraisa or not. The kazayas factor makes it deraisa.
So if it was less than that.
It's still a problem, but it's not deraisa. Yeah, but really the kazayas is like me saying an ounce. Not because ounce is relevant, but because it's easy to measure when you
Right.
give it a simple unit at the base. Okay, so these are the principles we're dealing with for the next two sifim. Have a lot of fun this week. It's going to be an involved learning, and it's going to require a little bit of concentration.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful day, everybody. Good week. Thank you for accommodating the changes in times. With Hashem's help, next week we'll be back on track. With respect to doing the second shir of Tzadik Aleph, tomorrow is a legal holiday, is it not?
No.
When's Halloween?
Halloween's not a holiday.
It's also Friday.
Oh, we don't get a day off. I was all excited. Maybe we can do a shir. I was thinking maybe we can do a shir tomorrow morning. Okay. So maybe I don't know. Maybe we'll do. Okay, maybe we'll leave it for the Chazara
Yeah.
weeks. Because in 3 weeks you have Chazara coming up anyway.
Right.
Maybe for that. Okay. And the truth is, I mean, it's a lot of the halacha lemaisi we did from on Tzadik Hey, on Tzadik Aleph, we covered in Kufay. A lot of it we did already, but still, okay. We'll just keep going forward. It's the best way to go.
It'd
Rather
be
than
definitely easier than this one.
Tzadik Aleph.
Yeah.
It's a review of Kufay.
Yeah.
This is all new information this week.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful day, everybody. Wonderful week.
You should already have we just